very elaborate policy, like BVN in Nigeria or in Ghana.
With over 700 million people connected either to 4G. Good afternoon, everyone, from here in North Africa, where I am, where the continent has convened for GITEX Africa. We're currently in Marrakesh. And to those joining from other zones, good day. Welcome to the Africa Hyperscalers Conversations, a global view where we use this interview series to unpack, to engage global leaders and explore ideas, investments, and infrastructure shaping Africa's digital future. I am Temitope Osunrinde, Director at Africa Hyperscalers. And today's conversation focuses on an unspoken question I see on faces everywhere in Africa, especially during conferences like this. I'm at GITEX, where we all speak so passionately about Africa and how we must leapfrog this and build that and invest there. But how do we translate this infrastructure ambitions into enduring digital capability? And across the continent, investments in subsea cables, terrestrial fiber, cloud platforms, and data centers is accelerating at an unbelievable pace. Just this week, GITEX announced a partnership between Maroc Data Centers and Oracle, one of the big hyperscalers. Today, Africa hosts up to 600 megawatts of live data center capacity, about 60 subsea cables, and 1.4 million kilometers of terrestrial fiber. And with over 700 million people connected either to 4G or 5G or some fiber-based connection, and that number is estimated to get about 900 million, almost a billion in about 4 or 5 years. Africa is more connected now more than ever before. Yet, execution capacity, financial structure, regional coordination or the absence of it, and policy credibility remains decisive constraints. This session with our distinguished speaker explores how governments on one part can develop frameworks, negotiate infrastructure partnerships more effectively, mobilize domestic capital, strengthen sovereignty strategies, and convert connectivity expansion into localized compute and economic value capture. And we're privileged to be joined today by Bright Simmons, President of mPedigree, a social enterprise working on 3 continents in partnership with governments, Fortune 500 companies, and grassroots organizations to spread innovative technologies, including patent-pending ones that protect communities from supply chain fraud. And this is a very important conversation in Africa today. He has led pioneering work at Harvard Innovation Labs with Cold Chain to invent and patent organosessions for biomedicals. And at IMANI, he led the organization's research capacity for more than a decade to become a top 5 think tank in Africa for innovation and impact. He serves on several boards, including Care International, European Biopharma, the Salzburg Global Seminar, and previously served on Microsoft's Africa Advisory Council and the Africa Strategy Group of the World Economic Forum. Bright's work sits at the intersection of public policy, risk analysis, institutional reform, and development finance evolution. Bright, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you so very much for having me, Timmy. There are not that many places having these kinds of conversations, so we're very happy that you're doing it.
Thank you so much, Bright. We'll get right into it. So you're the founder of mPedigree, but you're equally known, or more equally known, for your thinking, your writing, and commentary on Africa's political economy and institutional developments. That's actually how I knew you before I knew the mPedigree work that you do. So for someone who is trying to understand what's really happening across Africa today, from a social sense, from an economic sense, from a digital infrastructure sense, what frameworks or lenses would you recommend And what do you think Africans, what do you think non-Africans get wrong about the continent today?
So you're absolutely right that, my background is a bit checkered because I started off as a student activist and then realized that complaining alone doesn't make us much of a difference. You can protest and protest, but if you're not involved in trying to provide alternatives, the dominant default incumbent systems win by default, right? So you have to try and see whether you can help provide alternatives. So I became a social entrepreneur. And then having done it for about a decade, it became very clear to me that despite all the brilliance of the people that are working with us, all the innovations that we're pioneering, we're heavily constrained versus other innovators in other parts of the world because of the policy environment. And then I realized a lot of people were very focused on politics because they were looking for messianic leaders to save their countries or their continent. But the more, because of my more engineering, more technological, more systems focus, I realized that the politics is important, maybe 55% of the issue, but 45% of the issues are policy related. And therefore, it was, I was more likely to add value if I became a policy activist, in addition to be an entrepreneur and a social innovator, because my entrepreneurship is to solve social problems. And so when I see there are major constraints in the way of solving those social problems, I'll be, I'll be remiss if I didn't make an effort to contribute to solving them. So I became more of a systems entrepreneur. And in that context, most of the lenses, the frameworks that I will propose for understanding Africa are in the context of my own experience, and they are therefore systems related frameworks. I'm beginning to realize that some of them are pretty global. I started off very Africa-centric in terms of trying to understand the African condition. Started off with Ghana, then Kenya, then Nigeria, because I was working in those countries. But the more I've, looked at these things, the more I've pondered, the more I've mused about them, the clearer it becomes to me that some of these ideas are of global significance, just that Africa's stage of development makes them very applicable. So the first one is this very simple reality that a lot of us tend to downplay, and which is that Africa is a continent of what you might call temporal arbitrage. What that simply means is that at every one moment in time, different eras, different phases, different periods of transformation are happening at the same time, and retrogression are happening at the same time. So things are going backwards, some things are going forward, some things are highly modern, some things are pre-modern, and all of it is in tension. So that means, therefore, that the tendency to see, um, cumulative wins as being directional. So, for instance, if you think about fintech and mobile money, there were some people that thought we're going to invent a complete new financial system that's more reflective of our reality. That's naive. In Africa, what is more likely to happen is that you see a very advanced system coupled with incredible degrees of backwardness and even retrogression in some other systems within the same ports. So always thinking about where you are positioned in relation to these competing trends matter a lot. Trying to predict the future is a waste of time in Africa because there is really no simple future that is evolving in Africa in that sense. What is happening that certain things are accelerating, certain things are decelerating, certain things are static. And what is important as a strategist and as an analyst is how you look at how your whatever it is that you are doing, what you're interested in, is harnessing all the three trends at the same time. So there are always competing trends within any mega trends in Africa, and they matter more. I'm not saying that this doesn't happen elsewhere. I'm just saying it's more pronounced in Africa. The second lens that has helped me a lot is this idea of transmediation and fractal simplicity. Transmediation and all of these sounds like big words, but are really simple things. Just that I use them so that they are distinct, and you can kind of say, okay, what is this guy talking about? And you can follow through the chain of analysis. Transmediation and fractal simplicity simply means that a lot of economic structures are in the form of connections between one place where value is created and one place where value is consumed. So a lot of the time we think through intermediation lenses. Who is doing what, who needs it, and how do I connect? A lot of business thinking, emerges from that way of looking at things. But in practice, there is another type of connectivity, and that type I call transmediation. And it says that it's not about, a lot of the time, different strategies for transformation are not, one is not better than the other based on whether or not you choose your intermediation points carefully. But actually, the most transformative opportunities lie in whether or not you can detect latent nodes, convert them to nodes, and detect latent connectors and convert them to nodes. So essentially, rather than to think of, oh, look at the system very carefully and say, but this person is spending is undervalued because they're doing so much, but because it's not connected to this entity or that opportunity, they are not maximizing their potential. And therefore, I'm going to create a connection and make a lot of money. That's always work. Buy and sell in Africa is very much like that. You go to China, you see that they do very well there in certain areas. You see that we don't do very well. Then realize that all I have to do is create a bridge and I'm going to make a ton of money. People that have become very good at political jobbing in Africa, they do exactly that. The minister doesn't have money, but with a signature, you can create ₦1 billion overnight. So my job is to make sure I do the connection. I'm not saying that is not realistic. I'm just saying that value is not created transformatively through that channel. What is interesting is to look at something that doesn't look like a node now, and then look at another thing that doesn't look like a node and say, but if immediately I started to connect them and showed them, then immediately they become value nodes, right? So you look at higher education in Africa, and you go like, a lot of people are very keen on credentialism. They want the degree for the degree's sake, as opposed to trying to, actually learn, acquire skills. And then the part is then to think through and say, beyond just finding, mushroom schools in Eastern Europe and then getting them to issue degrees, what can I do about that? And it's obvious that it's harder because finding mushroom schools in Eastern Europe who will give cheap doctorates is much easier, right? And you're probably going to make more money. But if you could think more fundamentally about why is it that people do that, and is it really the fact that, for instance, people that don't want to be in school for a very long time but want to be acknowledged for the work the wisdom they've accumulated over the years, is there a way I can create a completely new credentialing system, looking at the whole society and looking at who could validate that, etc., and then create something? That's much harder, but in a lot of ways, that's what creates transformative change. Is the ability to all of a sudden see the latent nodes and say, actually, this person should connect to this one or that person should connect to that one. So that's transmediation. I think it's hugely important to Africa because the biggest constraint in Africa right now is the fact that our small enterprises don't grow big, right? So what then happens is that they attrite over time, they ablate over time, and they become informal. So rather than informality being some kind of categorization to informal versus formality, to me, it's a process thing. It's the process of becoming informal and the spectrum between formality and informality. And so even established companies in Africa very often retrogress into informality because formality doesn't pay, right? And the reason primarily is because when you are small, you are supposed to be highly productive and highly agile, and then grow fast, and then you become more stabilized, right? It's a plateauing. In Africa, that hasn't worked. That model hasn't worked. So we have a lot of people that are caught in a zombie mode of smallness, and they're increasingly unproductive as small. Even though typically small entities are supposed to be more productive, big companies have too much overhead, and small companies therefore bring the innovation that big companies then consume and ingest and then scale up. So that's how the German economy works, for instance. Or if you go to Volkswagen, you look at their supply chain, much of what is innovative about Volkswagen doesn't happen only in the R&D network, it happens in their supplier ecosystem. Small suppliers providing new things, showing them new capabilities, and then they integrate, right, in the R&D ecosystem. So if you have a country or a continent where a lot of your small entities are less productive than the big companies, you're in big trouble. It's an inverted paradigm. Now, that inverted paradigm comes about because in our continent, everybody wants to own the last mile. Everybody wants to own the customer relationship, right? So because you want to own the customer relationship, you want to own it from beginning to end, you end up over complexifying simple things. So you're trying to do something really simple, trying to get people to eat fresh mango juice. But then all of a sudden, you are also responsible for cold chain. You are responsible for doing your own phytosanitary stuff. If you want to be, you need that FDA registration in Ghana. But that FDA registration in Ghana, often there's no startup friendly consulting company that will get it for you. So you end up kind of mastering that relationship yourself to go and get your certificate, etc., etc., etc. You are doing too much. The question is, how do people emerge who make profits from solving the problems of the in-between, the intermediate problems, who don't own the last mile, who are not the ones that own the value all the way from production to consumption, but they are just in between connecting and making money off their connecting. That has been very difficult to understand. Some of it is policy, some of it is politics, very, very complicated. But that's another framework to use to understand. Maybe the third one is a lot, but We don't have time, so I'll try and weave them into the other parts of the conversation. The third one that I've also found very useful is what I'm calling catanomics, and I've been promoting for a very long time. And this idea that we become obsessed with politics without and politics is very important. Don't get me wrong. Politics is about 55% to 60% of what we need to fix. Any society need to fix to move forward. But there's also policy, and it appears as if policy is something that naturally emerges out of whatever politics you have. My conclusion that it's not. So I look at countries like Ghana, which are democratic in nature, and by every logic, a democratic country should be more deliberative, should be more transparent, should be more participatory in the way decisions are made. What I've discovered is that in actual fact, in Ghana, it's far less so. And the reason is because policy is specialized. If you want to talk about 5G policy in Ghana, which at some point I'm sure we'll get there, or 5G policy in Nigeria or Kenya, 99% of the population don't have much useful contributions to make, unfortunately. It's just the nature of the beast. So that immediately means, therefore, that it's a specialized area, which means an elite area. So you're going to have the elites play a bigger role than the masses. But that also then means you can have a very strong democracy where the masses feel like their voice are heard, radio stations are jamming, a lot of things are going on in terms of conversation, but they don't discuss the actual important issues because those issues are policy issues. So then you have to think about having a democracy and then there's yet still having another process which enables your policy making to be more participatory, more deliberative, more sophisticated. And that democracy doesn't give you the tools to solve it automatically. In fact, democracy can sometimes work against it because it can elevate voices that simply don't contribute to the conversation that really matter in respect of policy. So a lot of the time, I see people that get very passionate about Pan-Africanism and about making Africa strong on the world stage, about how do we project Africa's unique abilities. And I see them think in terms only of politics. They don't get into the policy trade-offs, the confrontations among different policy centers within their own societies. They are very, in my way, lethargic, ideationally lethargic. So an example would be, this African Union situation that we have, which is one of the only institutions we have to try and coordinate things. But when I talk to African elites who are very Pan-Africanist in orientation, they don't know anything about what goes on in the African Union. They don't understand it. They're not paying attention to the policy issues. Let's say open sky agreement. They will talk a lot about, Western influence and Western blah, blah, blah. But they don't understand what it takes for you to make flights cheap from Ghana to Gambia. They don't care either. They're not part of the Yamoussoukro debate. How can you be an elite who cares about Africa and continues to harass, or not even harass, to complain legitimately so, all the people that you think undermine the continent through whether it's French influence or American influence or British influence? And then when it comes to the issue that will make a difference, increasing connectivity across the continent by making airline fares cheap, you don't even know about Yamoussoukro. And yes, you are a Pan-Africanist, oriented person who really believes in getting the continent to unite and to do better. And the way they will respond is that, if we fix the politics, those things will fix themselves. I don't believe that. I think the politics is the way they are because we don't have any policy feedback loop. So you are able to just use rhetoric to rise in African politics without demonstrating capacity to lead through actually getting things done. Because people don't question you about the how. It's all about the what. So if I say the right thing about, I want Africa to own its own natural resources, I want Africans to be able to move freely across the border. I get the resource, but I don't only get applause, I also get power. I get people thinking that I am deserving of trust and respect. But how you actually move that, I don't have to get involved. And nobody is going to ask me. So over time, the people that can actually do those things get marginalized in politics. They don't activate political effects. And if you don't activate political effects, you are marginalized from a power point of view. So we have a lot of educated Africans, a lot of smart Africans all over the continent. I think our continent is the one where people who really know stuff about the key areas that we need to transform are most marginalized. I think it's far more so than the Middle East, which is, even though we are more democratic than the Middle East on average, it's definitely far worse than in South Asia and definitely far less than in Latin America. A lot of people that are very smart in Africa and are very involved in building these kind of things, they are highly individualistic in their contributions. They try and go and work with the minister, they go and work with a civil servant, they create something for their company, they create something for their allies. If you pay them a consulting fee, they will help you solve your thing. But that's what that's happening. And that is a big problem. So I'll leave it there, even though there are about 5 other frameworks that will be useful. But in the course of the conversation, I'll chip it in.
So it's an interesting starter. there's really definitely so much to talk about. But let's go using one of these frameworks, for instance, this policy versus politics conversation. Let's
Mm,
examine data sovereignty
mm,
as something we can apply this to. So, for instance, the context is most of Africa's data is outside the continent. We
mm,
we re-echo this 90% whatever is outside the continent. We use
mm,
this as an argument that we don't have enough data centers and so on and so on. And then we're beginning to see some governments also begin to talk around digital sovereignty, though not
mm,
digital isolation, or not digital isolation, but getting more data centers using anchor tenant model, getting government involved to stimulate local demand. If we're to look at data sovereignty within this framework of policy versus politics, how would you advise we approach it? What should we be doing? Who should be doing what?
So, as I always say, politics is about who gets what, right? Primarily, and what should be done, and who should decide, etc., etc. So, the policy is how you achieve whatever it is that the political vision sets out, right? Which means we must all be involved somehow in trying to shape the political vision. But I think Africa's political vision is well understood and is generally well supported. Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, right? We want to be respected on the world stage. We want our people to get good jobs. I don't think there's that much of a difference among people in terms of the what. So then the how is important. So in the what will be we want to control our own data. I want to maximize profitability from the fact that we are contributing data to the global commons. And the first political instinct then will be that why don't you just force people to keep the data locally, right? And so we introduce localization requirements. And we've seen some other countries try it and the rest of it. The policy way of looking at the policy lens would be to say, first of all, what kinds of data are we generating? Do they enhance the tacit advantages of African actors? By which I mean that there's a tendency in Africa not to document. And this is actually quite impressive. Like I've looked at policy frameworks in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and you see a very elaborate policy, like BVN in Nigeria or in Ghana, Ghana card and the rest of it. One day, just try to get enough first party accounts, which means the government's account of what they were trying to achieve, what did they anticipate to be the likely challenges, how have what they've done so far led them to where they are, what is the next set of strategies and the rest of it. And most of what you find is highly generic. You should try it. You want to try it. Try it. Take BVN or any of the well-known data-related and IT-related policies in Ghana and just try and make a sense of, and nowadays with artificial intelligence, you can even do it over in a few minutes. Just synthesize all of it and then see. And a few things will emerge. One is be a huge gap between what the official record says and what's actually happening, which means that all the value is still in tacit bounds or tacit receptacles. It's still in people's heads. So it's only a few groups of people in Africa, in an average African country, who really understand what is going on. And therefore, the data you have, it doesn't matter whether it sits in Europe or it sits in Ghana, it's not yet action ready. Right. So that is why when you try and use a lot of AI systems, I'm actually writing I'm working on wear my ODI hat, a number of fairly elaborate essays on AI and development that I've had going for many, many months. But I will give you a teaser. If you ask AI to help you to create an artifact for a government process or a regulatory process, some kind of thing like that in Africa, it will give you a perfect example of something that works brilliantly in Europe, America, and the rest of it. And the beautiful thing is that you might actually be able to use that to walk through a regulatory process in Ghana or Africa, so long as you have the relations tight sorted out. Okay. The funny thing is that how you actually go ahead implementing whatever it is that you are going to implement, for which reason you wanted the license or whatever, will be completely different from what is on record. So the most exciting example of that in a Ghanaian context or a Nigerian context is what we call the informal mining sector. So solid minerals in Jos. The people that have the license and the people that don't have the license, 90% of the time, I assure you, they are not different. They are not mining differently. What is even more critical, the way they mine and what the license purports to say they should mine have no correlation. Now you may say, okay, that's an extreme issue around capacity and money and things like that. That's true. But I'm saying that it's a spectrum and it covers so many other things that we do, which is that the informal prevails. But the
Mm,
informal is highly tacit and it's small groups of people with knowledge in their head, undocumented. It's the same way that, a banker was telling me 2 days ago, he's a Ghanaian banker, that, one of the biggest paint manufacturers came to talk to him and wanted a loan. And he asked for, his books and things like that. And he said, well, I can go and prepare something for you. But to be honest with you, we don't really operate with all these things with each other. We have a sense of it, we have a feel for it. So what the guy will go and do is, in the old days, you pay a consultant, and the consultant will hire some people and they'll put it together. In a few months from now, you'll probably get an intern in the house, and the person will go to AI and generate some
mhm,
things, and will
mhm,
bring it to the bank,
mhm.
right? Now,
And you
half the
get the
time,
loan.
even for the bank, it's an informal process. They will look at it and they will make some whatever, but a lot of it is going to be instant. There was a very good example that some time ago we're using in the context of urban Africa.
Mhm,
Aspirational urban Africa. You go to maybe it's changing in some places, but for a very long time, you go to somebody's office, and one of the things they did was they walked out with you to see the car you brought in
mhm.
because the car you drove in was a heuristic
It's an
that gave them a
assessment.
sense
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm,
And sometimes you look at the watch you wear and things like that. Things that in a East Asian sense will never play a role because in the East Asian sense, you're going to have a billionaire show up in a rickety car or wearing a cheap Seiko watch. So those heuristics that we've developed in many, many aspects of our life are not easily capturable by data. So we have to first ask ourselves whether or not the value of the data is segmented. There's a
mm,
kind of data that doesn't matter too much what the local nuances is valuable everywhere. Think of basic financial account management data, how you run your bank account.
mm,
Whether the data sits in Geneva or sits in Zurich or sits in South Africa, it doesn't really matter.
mm,
And then somebody might say in those instances, might the issue really be who can do it at the cheapest and the most reliable way? And therefore, we shouldn't have even data localization about such things. That's a good policy debate.
mhm,
Then they have data that is highly integral to what makes us competitive, our edge. And in that regard, AI that stimulates informality because it allows you to avoid having to do the heavy work of actually transforming because the AI can help you generate the artifacts. That kind of situation, that is where rather than to think of localization as a matter of data ownership in locally owned data centers, you
mm,
think about it as a matter of small models in and small data systems, but with highly valuable data.
mm,
They are tacit data that other than a few people in the world you can get out.
mm,
So UUV, which is extreme ultra lithography, you can go and get all the patents in the world. You can go and get all the data around the machinery, and there's a lot. You cannot still produce one, even if you are China.
mm,
Only one company in the Netherlands today can do like sub-nanometer, 2 nanometer type chips in the world. And it doesn't matter whether you are China, you have all the other ancillaries, you still can't do it. China recently managed to do something that shocked people in Shenzhen because they got very close to creating these kinds of chips. But that prototype is still way below. It's like 2 generations behind what the Dutch can provide. Why is a small company in the Netherlands the only one who can do it? Because for many, many years, they have created a strategic fountain as well as a moat around these defensible ideas.
mhm,
And that data they have is not online. You cannot find it in an AI model, etc. etc. I think there's also a tendency to then misunderstand the whole LLM revolution to things about just big data sitting where and you just have to create a big parameter model. A lot of the more transformative things like the frontier of biomaterials, pharmaceuticals are not relying on LLMs at all. In fact, they're relying on very specialized algorithms
mm,
managed by very specialized people that build on knowledge they already have, often in their heads. And then as the model specializes, they isolate it from the global internet. And they have very, very defensible intranets and which they use. So my question for you for data sovereignty, and in the way I know I'm cheating by throwing back to you, will be, have we done that thinking around what
mm,
is truly valuable, what is not valuable, what is commoditized, and therefore it doesn't matter which data center is sitting, we should just get for the cheapest, and where the
mm,
values at inference time versus where the values at training time. I don't see that. I
mm,
see a lot of big strategies being launched, AI strategies, and I always sit back and I look at them and I smile. So Ghana just launched one. Kenya has had one for a while now in terms of policy rails,
mm,
but they don't seem as if anybody has been doing any debates like the one that we're having now. This weird fascinating debate, we had a lot of time because you
Mm,
could go back and forth, but they don't. The residue of such debates don't reflect in our documents. So I call them artifacts. These are things we've created as
mm.
policies, but they are not really policies. They haven't been tested through any crucible of deliberation.
So there's a bit of that. So Nigeria is currently going through one. It's called the National Sovereign Cloud Initiative. And
Mm,
obviously what it did, and this is one of the very good things that Nigeria did, it put in
mm,
while the Nigerian regulator is enabling it and driving it, it is not the one leading it. So it
mm,
brought in the hyperscalers.
mm,
It brought in Microsoft, brought in
mm,
Google, brought in Mastercard, brought in Equinix, and they are the
mm,
ones leaders in those companies are the ones who are driving the strategy, obviously.
mm.
And then they also had a tiered system where they
That's
looked
very
at
good,
what
right? But let
data.
me sound a note of caution. I don't doubt that experts get involved in making policy in Africa. Absolutely not.
Mhm,
Experts absolutely get involved. In fact, that's one of the things that we do very well, getting the grant money to go and pay for consultants.
mhm,
The question is whether the trade-offs were such that
mhm,
there were differences of opinion reflected in the final strategy and in such a manner that it would generate political effect eventually. But what I mean by this, typically, if you do it well,
mhm.
policy well, then you're going to have people that disagree with one thing or the other because policy is naturally disaggregating. It
Absolutely.
naturally opens up a whole bunch of other things.
Mhm,
Whereas politics aggregates, right? Policy disaggregates. So you always have fragmentation.
mhm,
Now, that fragmentation is resolved through consensus. That is a different kind of consensus in politics.
mhm,
It's based on temporal postponements. It's based on hierarchies and prioritization, sequencing, and things like that. It's not like politics where you just simply gloss over them and have a broad theme, right? So that sequencing and those kind of things, that is where the political effect comes from. Because people ask you, why did you prioritize this over this? That only works if you have a real, fully functioning non-catanomic system. Because the catanomic system is such that the policy staff don't at all interface with the political staff. So you do all of this work around the sovereign cloud. But the residue of the debate among the people, first of all, how did the people assemble? Was it a critical mass of divergent views? Then the next one being that what those trade-offs, how were they resolved? That is what eventually, when it then comes into the political terrain, the people that lost in that process of synthesizing still have the means to talk. And then you see a political effect. So like net neutrality in the West, for many years you had net neutrality. There were great arguments on all sides.
mhm,
And eventually you saw the policies emerge, but they were highly political because you'd gone through that real process of trade-off
mm,
and hierarchies and prioritization. So my sense is that you are right that the Nigerian process probably is very expert-driven, very industry-driven. It's great. And given our context, probably the best can be done. But I still think it's somewhat catanomic because the transformation from policy to
mhm,
generate political effect will
mhm,
always be weak in the kind of system that we've built.
mm. Yeah, so I think it's obviously it's one of the newest ones. There's still ongoing work there.
Mm,
They're currently at the phase where they are reviewing the policy. They have pushed out some about three documents. They're currently seeking public opinion on that and reviewing that, and then over time, as they accumulate more public opinion and public information around it, they would
we hope it works.
improve that process. So I want to go into now. So one of the reasons why well, my proposal is one of the reasons why Africa is still where it is. So there's so much work that's been done, especially in terms of digital infrastructure now, more than we have we have more capabilities now more than ever. But
Mm,
the gap between us and the rest of the world is growing
not
farther and
shrinking.
farther. Is the gap is actually increasing between us and the
In
rest of the
some
world.
areas. In some
It's
areas, yeah.
increasing. Um, so now, but one of the postulations said is because we are
Mm,
not as organized, right? So other continents have a bit more. Maybe there's a bit more. Look at China; it's a country. Look at India. The size of India is probably the size of all of most of Africa. There's
population-wise, yeah.
homogeneity in what they do. So it's easy for them to say, okay, we're going to go in one direction,
Mm,
and they go in one direction. And maybe that sort of comes back to the conversation we had initially around democracy, how we are more democratic, but yet the ones who are less democratic are the ones who are getting things done. But the real question here is, so you have all these institutions. You have ECOWAS, you have WIMO, you
African Union.
have Africa Union, you have how What roles can these guys play? What roles should they be playing? What are they not doing right? And what roles should they potentially play in cross-border infrastructure coordination so that all of us can begin to work together? Because I'm looking at this AI revolution, and the world is investing significantly. We haven't even woken up.
Mm.
So how would you sort of weigh in on that?
So, there are, if you take Cassava, Liquid Intelligence, all the guys that are trying to build, infrastructure on the African continent um, to do this. And, the challenge when you look deeply at how you solve the collective action problem is that you start and you try and you go to the AU meetings or whatever, and then you abandon it. So we also saw Masiyiwa being very active in the AU forum during the COVID period, and now he doesn't talk about that anymore, and I don't really see them talk about the AU anymore. The reason is pretty straightforward, and it's something I call policy stamina. We have got a politics right, which is that integration is the way forward. Africa, because of where we are starting off from, we need to accelerate. And to accelerate, it's just better that we have scale. And then scale. The problem is, as always, that political vision is the easiest part. The hard part is the how. And it's not because the how is technically intensive. That's not the point. The real issue is that there are trade-offs and there are different ideas, right? So you need to have a mechanism that allows you to crash those different ideas, to knock heads together and get the best to come out, and then sequence and then prioritize, and then say, okay, this one we will do it when this happens, etc. Is that part that we miss? That part requires a different culture of deliberation, a different institutional setup to favor it. We have to be naturally. I'll give you a very practical, and this is controversial, but if you look at the Western epistemic model, how knowledge is organized in the West, there's one thing that some Africanists actually say is their weakness, and we should be happy we are not like that. But I think, from a policy point of view, at least in our current state of development, I'm not too sure. And that is this tendency to be so focused on originality to a very granular level, right? So all their scholarship is based on who said this first. You have to quote them, and you have to show how yours is different marginally. And that's everything that they do is about that, right? Who owns this idea, and how is this marginally different, and how is yours, and how you have to do your citation and all of that. That culture is actually not very prevalent in oral culture. Oral culture is very synthesizing. Do you remember anybody trying to make an effort to find out who came up with the first Yoruba proverb in a particular
No,
context and spend a lot of
no.
time in?
It's
I'm not
culture.
talking about a modern scholar operating in the
Yeah,
Western tradition, like
yeah.
an African wise man, spending a
No,
lot of time, this proverb, where it came from. We don't do that, right?
no.
But the fact that we don't do that also means that our epistemic universe is a bit different, our epistemic culture is a bit different. I think in policy, that's a problem. And I haven't solved it yet in terms of can we marry this? The reason why it's a problem is that a lot of the time, when you are the person who is pointing out the downside, the small problem, the edge case, in an African meeting, I feel like people think you are a problem. They just, you are not very useful. Because I do that a lot and I get a lot of pushback. I'm the guy who naturally, as soon as something comes up, my brain just naturally goes to the edge case and this one and what's and then what about that? And that's just how my brain works. But I find that a lot of African elite settings, it's seen as not very wise because the goal is to look for the deeper pattern. We are fractal thinkers, right? So the goal is to look for the deeper pattern, which somehow synthesizes most of it, and we still go for it. I think that is useful in politics. And if we apply our minds to it, we'll probably redeem our politics, and Africa will be very great. As you know, there are some currents already in music and whatever that shows what we can do when we put our minds to it. And Africans everywhere in the world are doing amazing things. So clearly, there are advantages to the way we think, which are incredible, which gives us incredible power. But I also think when it comes to collective action, when we have to do things together, that thing glosses over trade-offs, conflicts, and I don't mean conflicts in material terms. For conflict in material terms, we don't have an issue. But additional conflicts. We don't seem to put a lot of emphasis on this person said that, and they are crashed. I often tell people who are African and very educated, let me take on an area of African scholarship that you are interested in, say personality philosophy. African philosophers like Redu and JH are leaders in personality politics. What is a person? Personhood. And I asked them, yeah, but what is the difference between JH and Redu? And Even the highly educated people can't remember, because that's not how they remember. That's not what drives them. Or I say, the Mandela model versus, say, the Chibuki model, or the difference between Tambo's view of post-apartheid, whatever. I say that they will never dwell on it. I see a lot of glossing over. Even the difference between Pan-Africanist Marxists in South Africa, like a Julius Malema, versus highly Africanist essentialists. We just gloss over it, right? So that leads to problems with the AU and the EU and the rest, because often all the conversation is about the grand politics, the big summit, the big declarations, Agenda 2063, the AU passport. And then as soon as that, the lights turn off, the policy issues come into view. If you want to issue an AU passport, does that mean that the ECOWAS passport must be abolished? Or am I going to carry an AU passport and an ECOWAS passport? And why would we not have thought about it? Because this is an obvious thing, right? A class 3 boy in the room when you are debating the AU passport, that's the first thing we say. But I have my ECOWAS passport, so the AU passport, how will we deal with it? My belief is that in Africa, we will gloss over it, and so we'll figure it out we'll cross the bridge. But I think in Europe, what made it effective in terms of the European Union and building pan-European institutions was this tendency, because of the epistemic culture, there was this tendency to focus a lot on the trade-offs and the conflict things, and then to get their compromises and build on it. So the compromises themselves, out of that additional tension, became the fuel for building these institutions. They are products of that tension. But if we don't have that tension, where is that fuel going to come from? Because if you are not going to have people that are going to hold their ground and say, no, what we should have rather is an AU passport issued by ECOWAS. And this is then the dynamics. And then someone say about what is wrong with that. Instead of having that in the open and having people that become associated with it, and then have high stakes. Because your reputation depends on whether your idea gets taken or not. And everybody knows you are the one who proposed this and it failed. But then you propose this and it won. We don't seem to have additional stakes, intellectual stakes in the different ways we can do things. Now, when you don't have that, what is the motivation for people to build up to move the idea? Because in the West, where people become additionally, they have stakes. They become reputationally invested in the idea winning. That's how their system works. People build coalitions to move the idea forward. If we gloss over the detail, so nobody is heavily invested in one strategy or the other about mobility across borders, they're going to have trouble. So in the case of infrastructure development, take, for instance, what you just described around common data centers and then common hubs. To do a common hub, you have to have a way in which you ration the benefits. So you have to say, okay, we want Rwanda to be a hub for this hyperscaler data center. But in Rwanda being the hub, then Rwanda won't get this, and Burundi will get this, and Kenya will get this, and this one. That kind of thing is very elaborate and takes a lot of time. And you need people who are going to have intellectual stakes in one model versus the other. Otherwise, what you have is what we have today: 54 countries trying to do all the infrastructure at the same time saying that they want to do cross-border infrastructure development. That's not going to work. You have what we have today, which is all the big cables landing on the coast. And then when it comes to how you move that inland, and what is the new dynamic around how you move that inland? Because the coast is where the money is in Africa, right? The big capitals are often the coast. You land the sea cable there, you get the rich people in the country, they pay you money, you move their data out, you become a transit economy. If you want to change that, you want to do inland integration, cross-border integration across Africa, then just like trade, you have to ask yourself who is consuming what from which African country and what is our benefit from a policy point of view to say that, okay, we in Nigeria are fine with cheap fuel from Benin. Sorry, we are happy with cheap fuel move from Nigeria to Benin, even though we are subsidizing it, because we will get this other thing from Benin in 10. It's the same in data. There's not that much different in making the decisions around who will get what and who will lose what, right? I think that part requires stamina. It requires you to go on, fight it, get one compromise, and then move on. That stamina requires fuel. That fuel comes from people having reputational stakes in their idea winning over the other person's idea and the rest of it. And that requires a different epistemic culture and how we organize our collective action problems. We are organized to solve our collective action problem. I don't see that culture prevalent in the area and the rest. What I see is a lot of glossing over, a lot of political statements, and then very little debate around how it. And the debate is not just simply how we do it, and so therefore the technical detail that accumulatively build on. It's about the trade-offs, the tensions, the disagreements. This is the better way. When you don't have that at the AU level in country, so for instance, there's no one that has built a coalition to oppose open sky in Nigeria. because he thinks Nigeria's air industry it won't benefit from. That tells you that they are not even taking it serious, right? Because what will happen, like what we saw with AFTA, was that there were people that were opposed to Nigeria acceding to the AFTA, the free trade agreement. But those people were not in public debate. They were powerful people who were whispering in the ears of powerful people. My sense is if there was a real policy underlayer or underbelly, you will have seen that debate in the open, and that would have built coalitions, and that's how you will have propelled forward. So that's the reason why we can't do cross-border digital infrastructure and things like that. It's more fundamental than that. Of course, we can then go up and then talk about the role of the big, Silicon Valley corporations and how they are taxed and what are the incentive structures that have been put in place and whether or not IXPs and the way they will structure them and position them allows us to have a good sense of the value of data. We can do all of that, but I'm saying that we have to start off from the very basic structure of the epistemic logic that we are dealing with, and then we can move into that level and have that conversation. Otherwise, we're just being pedantic, but we're not really solving any problem.
It's quite an interesting angle because I see this. If you see something wrong, people are hesitant to talk because they don't want to be obviously accused of going against the grain. Yes, there are other broader conversations. But maybe this question, and then I'll just add the last question because I think we're a bit over time already. So outside Africa, there's a bit more pragmatism, there's a bit more debate oriented. So here, because of maybe cultural norms, you don't want to, someone is in power, someone is in government, someone is your leader, that's nature not to be as argumentative with them and so on. It's cultural, right? But how best then can we make that work, given that we have sort of like a different cultural, still ensuring that that debate, that conversation, that friction still comes on, but maybe possibly the way it works in China, right? Where they still have everybody is going to the koto to the CCP, but they still have important conversations about what needs to be done.
That's exactly what I was going to say. China and Korea are more hierarchical than we are. But the difference is that they also have a historic culture of Mandaриnism, of writing things and building schools of thought, right? So a guru write a particular line, a new guru can simply emerge by writing another line. And over time, you have multiple strands of thought and you can combust them. So over time, even if you have a very hierarchical culture, within ideas, the people at the same level will still debate, right? You may not be, if you are the abstract scholar in Tsinghua University, you're probably a bit more careful trying to say that, some luminary at Peking University who is on a consultative committee of the CCP in some area doesn't know what they are talking about. But it doesn't mean that you cannot lay out a new theory because it's part of the Mandarin culture of coming up with schools of thoughts, right? And you can see that also very much in the way that Buddhism moved to India and the way it was absorbed through textual reinterpretation and new lines of gurus. So my sense is that the cultural thing is not like an essentialist thing I'm making. I'm not like Africans are just like that. I'm just saying that there are structural incentives in the way that oral culture built things up that led to a praxis, the way we operate, that doesn't incentivize focusing on edge cases, focusing on tensions and ideas, etc. But when it comes to material context, we are not very differential. When it comes to some 40-year-old person fighting over some deal in Nigeria and summoning godfathers and whatever, we're not differential at all. It's only in ideas. It's only in the realm of ideas that we are not sufficiently motivated to emphasize who has this particular idea versus that idea, and then keep track, and then as they ascend by each other, that's just not. And so I don't think it's like something deeply innate in us. I just say that it's historically contingent. It's the way our history has evolved from oral culture to present. That remember in the beginning, I told you that we have things that are in parallel. We have cultures that are in parallel. So one of the cultures that are in parallel is the fact that in some instances we really don't like to document all the detail. We are not algorithmic. So when you try and ask people, but I want to get the full detail and the rest of it, people like to hedge. They like to hold up. So if you have that, and you are trying to then build a system to do digital connectivity effectively and do all of these things like we're trying to do in 5G in Ghana and the rest of it, your you are constrained by the fact that it's not clear to people what are you optimizing for and against.
Mhm.
It's not clear to people. So that the issues are often not sufficiently described,
Mhm.
well described, so that from a political level we can say we support this or we support that. So ultimately, my sense of these matters is that things are happening by default. And
Mm.
the way we change it is to build a new community of young people that somehow, because we can create a new commune online and the likes of it, some people are even anonymous and stuff, we can increasingly peer into the layers that often get glossed over.
Mhm.
I think that's important, but that's just an epistemic culture issue. So that
Mm.
aside. Then in
Mm.
terms of more practical issues around the challenges that we are facing with choices between India, China, Turkey, all of these people emerging, G42 in the UAE. Do we build sovereign models or don't we build sovereign models? Do we focus on inference time and the likes of it? I think a conversation like this is too short for us to delve
Mm.
into it in great
Mhm.
detail.
Mhm.
But we have to make people aware that these choices are not simple,
Mhm.
right? If you decide that, as a country, we want to ensure that, 5G licenses don't become monopolized, because a lot of us have sleepwalked into a situation in Africa where maximum two telcos are profitable, every other telco is now unprofitable. And you don't, that's the truth. In almost every African country, you have one or two telcos who are profitable and the rest
The
are
dominant
basically.
ones. Yeah.
Now, but the telcos will also tell you that from an OTP point of view, all the value is migrating to the data platforms.
Mm.
And in that world, more or less, a few big players in America and elsewhere are complete dominant. So what do we do in those kind of situations? And then you have to ask yourself, okay, do we support, because look at the recent decision by MTN to shut down some of the services that they are trying to use for the OTC space.
Mhm.
And you say, okay, looking at all of that, what is our attitude towards telcos being innovation champions versus that we've been deeply focused on competition,
Mhm.
right? Because there are attempts, for instance, in some of our countries now use anti, um, what do we even call it? Competition law. And there's a term that is not coming to
Antitrust,
antitrust,
yes, yes.
yeah, logic to
Mhm.
try and improve competition among big telcos in our country. But the question is that your big worry or is Google your big worry?
Mm.
These are not easy questions. You see what I'm going?
Mm.
Do we want MTN to be strong enough that they can build an African ecosystem for African
Mm.
apps, African
Mhm.
focused
Mhm. Mhm.
services?
Mhm.
Or are we more worried that if MTN is too dominant in Ghana,
Mhm.
then perhaps they are going to overprice?
Mhm.
These are the kinds of policy trade-offs that are not easy.
I
And those
have
are
been
the
thinking,
values.
absolutely. I've been thinking about that because, so one of the reasons why a lot of investors are unable to invest in Africa is because we are too small. The scale
Individually.
that they typically invest in is
Mm.
too small. They don't look, they look at you, they look at Africa, okay, this is a great place, but
Is you are too small, and one, you don't grow fast enough.
yes,
Because
and
a
you don't grow
startup is
fast
a
enough.
small company that grows very fast. It's
Yes,
designed to grow fast.
yes. So you don't grow fast, you're not growing, you're too small. But then you also have the MTNs that they are big, but as they're also trying to be bigger, trying to
Mm.
acquire IHS, obviously they have to step on
Some
toes.
tools.
Yes. So now we are in that middle ground. Do we want big companies like MTN to be bigger? And then what are the opportunities there? Or do you want to use antitrust to limit them to say, okay, you should be doing better, you should be. So really, as you have said, there's a delicate balance between
Very
between
good.
that.
And then the question is, what's your scale of evaluation? What is your unit of analysis? Because is it MTN in your country? Is it MTN regionally? Is it MTN continentally? Is it an alliance of MTN and other network partners in the value chain that you can look at? All of these take a lot of data
Hmm.
analysis to get to any sensible
Hmm.
recommendation. You also know that, as much as possible, edge issues are important. And there have been attempts to try and mobilize to see if we can get cheap phones so that all our people can move into, because we did very well in 2G, but I don't know if people are paying attention. We've started to fall behind in 4G and 5G again.
Yeah.
So we said, we leapfrogged.
Hmm.
But we leapfrog based on a particular set of economic parameters, right? And now all of a sudden, 5G and 4G, we are starting to fall behind again. I think 5G, we are what, 16% across the continent, or even less, etc. So you look at all of those things and say, okay, we want edge devices that are 5G enabled, we want them cheap. You remember that Mara tried this, right? Tried to get these devices down price, and they had a strategy to have a couple of countries and you have government. Ultimately, it boils down to whether or not you can mobilize, really, because even Africa is big not only in terms of scale. Africa is also big in terms of the fact that ideas don't percolate easily. So you'll be doing something brilliant in Rwanda very well, and yes, you're not able to send it to the rest of the continent. Part of it is because we don't have the infrastructure that elevates our ideas. So that somebody who comes up with something brilliant in Burundi, all of a sudden it's a regional success story, it's a regional hero, right? So there's a lot around the filtration of ideas that will enable us to say, okay, you know, this edge device computing issue that these people have solved in Rwanda, we need it in Ivory Coast. And here is the political economy that makes me think that bringing somebody in from Rwanda makes sense than bringing somebody in from Taiwan or bringing somebody in from Eastern Poland, right? But what is that political economy? What are the constituencies? We've created a Pan-African business chamber of different kinds and the rest of it. But we still seem to struggle when it comes to the infrastructure for integrating our ideas. We are talking a lot about cross-border integration. I'm trying to convince you that one of the problems we have, I always challenge people and say, think of a very well-known intellectual in the West who could visit another Western country and meet the president just because of his or her ideas. And it's not difficult to come up with a couple of economists, a couple of technologists, a couple of this who can do that. Then I say, do the same for Africa. Find a couple of people who don't have money, so essentially they're not building big businesses, or don't have political power. And tell me how many of those will be known if they showed up, if they said the person was Mauritanian and he showed up in South Africa, it will be known. And it sounds like a crude, simplistic, whatever. But the point is that you can't. It's very often the case that there are not many Africans in the realm of ideas that do that. So it means, therefore, that you must succeed. So it becomes a chicken and egg problem. You must succeed before you can scale. But to scale, you need to succeed. And that has been one of the biggest challenges. I know that because in 2010, we made Nigeria the first country to do pharmaceutical traceability from factory to the patient. And even though we've done that in Nigeria and it was dramatic, it was never celebrated, right? Because the infrastructure for understanding that, for putting it in the right place, it's just not there on a continental level. So moving from Nigeria to every country required me to rebuild my reputation all over again, rebuild relationships all over again. I dare say that in Europe, they have a much better integration beyond infrastructure, and they did it before infrastructure, which allows ideas to move very fast. Look at how quickly Lutheran ideas on Protestantism moved, even in those days, because of the network of ideas circulation. So ideas diffusion is actually bigger than we think. If we are going to be able to do these things, yes, finance is important. We have to watch very closely how IFC has done this in East Africa with blended fiber optic structures. We have to study all of these things. But I think that we underestimate ideas at our own peril. We underestimate policy at our own peril. And the only contribution I can make that adds value, and it's different from when you talk to the specialists and when you talk to people that are deep in the business, is to try and force you to begin to think about the epistemic, the policy, the ideational infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure, not just the business models that allow cross-border digital data centers and the like to operate. And I hope that has been a useful contribution to your series.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian. And I think I'm so grateful to you for sharing these insights with us today, and so much to learn from the frameworks and every other thing we talked about. I think we definitely need to have another conversation. There were many things we wanted to sort of touch on today, we were unable to. But we'll definitely look out to definitely try and we'll get you. I know you're very busy, but we'll try and get you for some other time. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you so very much, Timmy. Wishing you all the best. Bye.
Thank you so much. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you for being part of Africa Hyperscalers Conversations, a global view. We look forward to more of these conversations as Africa continues to build its next phase of digital infrastructure. All right, wherever you are, good afternoon, good evening, good day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Brad, again.